pretty much everyone is familiar with the cosmological argument for God. The fine-tuning argument, the extremely vague God of the gaps. We don't know how the universe began, so God did it. Less people are familiar with the ontological argument, which came sooner. Some have argued that less people are familiar with it because it's more difficult to understand, but really it's more difficult to swallow. There are so many flaws with this argument, and here's an introduction from Crash Course Philosophy.
11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds but also in reality, like pizza and horses, something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great. But wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner. Smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich, would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too, and from there he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality. Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better, therefore God must exist in reality.
I'm sure you're already thinking about many ways where this argument doesn't work, and not surprisingly, it didn't take long before it was debunked.
But one of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Guanelot, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed, the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Guanelot said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real.
Some people have argued that Guanelot's argument doesn't fit because the original example was the perfect being, and so an island and everything else wouldn't be as great as the maximally perfect being. But the structure can be used for anything. So even though the original example was to use this structure for a maximal being, it could be used for anything. All we're talking about here is word games with definitions. So absolutely you can say the perfect island is a place where you can swim and ski and must exist. You can use this for anything. A fellow that goes by Emperor Atheist talked about the maximally great T-bone steak and potato. Because this argument is so flawed and there's so many ways to debunk it, you can argue that the island analogy isn't the best way to debunk it, but it's still very much a valid argument that this structure can be used for anything, which makes the ontological argument silly and meaningless. Now, centuries later, another way of debunking this argument came about.
One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object. And Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence of their subjects, Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence.
So a ridiculous argument came out 1,000 years ago. It was debunked multiple times. Why are we even talking about this? I mean, it's not like anyone today would still be promoting this nonsense. I mean, no one would possibly be that shameless. Would they?
The ontological argument is an argument intended to show that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God exists. So if this argument is sound, it puts the atheist in a very awkward position.
If this argument is sound, it puts the atheist in an awkward position. If this argument is sound, it puts dictionaries in an awkward position. Because according to Webster, possible and existing are not synonymous with each other. But notice the choice of language. If this argument is sound, he's not saying it isn't ridiculous. He's not saying it's something he personally follows. He's saying if it's sound. Well, how meaningless is that statement? If it's sound that Godzilla exists, then Tokyo is going to be in an awkward position.
The ontological argument goes something like this. God is by definition the greatest conceivable being. Now,
by whose definition? Over the history of mankind, there have been millions of gods, with people defining these gods in many ways.
What would the greatest conceivable being be like? Well, he would be omnipotent. He would be omniscient. He would be all good. And he would be necessary in his existence. He would exist in all possible worlds. Now, if such a being is possible, that means that a being like that exists in some possible world.
By possible worlds, he's talking about worlds that people can imagine. Imaginary worlds. But imaginary worlds can be anything, because it's up to imagination. You don't have the authority. You can't dictate that everybody must define God in this tight little box, according to this guy from the 11th century. If you're imagining these worlds, then you can imagine them to have 1,000 gods or no god, man god, woman god, cat god, dog god, horse god, cow gods, whatever you want. We're talking about imagination. We're talking about worlds like the world of Harry Potter, the Middle Earth of Lord of the Rings, the Alice's Wonderland. And to say that if something's possible, then it must exist in a possible, meaning imaginary world. What does that even mean?
But you see, if a being of that nature exists in even one possible world, then it exists in all of them.
If it exists in one imaginary world, it must exist in all imaginary worlds. But here's the thing. Imagine a world where what's maximally great in other worlds is minimally great in this world. And in this world, there's a God killer that sees this minimally great God and kills it, and as soon as it does, this God ceases to exist everywhere. Because by definition, a God killer kills gods. And it wouldn't be dead if it just didn't exist in one world. It would have to not exist in all worlds. We're talking about imagination, and we can easily define all sorts of imaginary ways for this imaginary all-powerful being to get his imaginary ass kicked.
But if it exists in all of them, then it exists in the actual world.
If it exists in all imaginary worlds, then it must exist in the actual world.
Therefore, God exists. So the argument is basically, if you think that God's existence is possible, then it follows that God exists.
The ontological argument for God is the dumbest argument ever. We're now going to end this video with the maximally great ending for a YouTube video, which by definition has to have the Cisco Kid and Poncho.
Cisco, do we have to leave all our good friends now? Only until next time, Pancho. Adios, amigos.